The year was 1853, deep in the sweltering south. The old plantation house stood like a monument of silence, its white columns gleaming under the sun while shadows stretched across the fields. To the world outside, it was a place of elegance and order, but within its walls, secrets pressed against the ceilings like trapped smoke. Behind the heavy oak doors, where laughter and music often masked unease, there existed another truth. It was whispered only in the kitchens, carried in trembling voices by those who served. They spoke of a boy who was never meant to be seen. His name was Malachi. Born of the mistress and one of her own servants, his very existence was an unspeakable scandal. He was neither permitted to belong nor allowed to vanish. Instead, he was hidden in the attic, a shadow above the house, breathing in silence while the family below lived in pretense. At night, the wind pressed against the shutters, and those who passed by swore they heard faint footsteps above the rafters. Some dismissed it as rats. Others crossed themselves and walked faster, but those who knew the truth said nothing. For Malachi was not just a child in hiding, he was the wound the family tried to bury, and the secret that refused to die. The mistress of the house carried herself with grace before her guests, her gowns stitched in silk, her words polished like glass. But beneath the finery, she was a woman bound by fear of whispers, fear of ruin, fear of the truth that breathed above her ceiling beams. Malachi was her secret. Each day she climbed the narrow attic stairs with a tray of bread and water, never more. She did not look him in the eye. She could not, for in his face she saw the crime of her own heart, a child born of love forbidden by law and blood. The servants watched in silence. They knew the boy's father, one of their own, had been sold off in the dead of night to keep the household clean, but no sale could erase the proof that lingered upstairs. So the mistress made her bargain with God and with herself. Malachi would never leave the attic. He would never run through the fields, never climb the magnolia trees, never speak his name aloud where others could hear. In exchange, her family's name would remain untarnished, her wealth intact, her reputation untouched. But bargains made in silence have a way of breaking, and as Malachi grew, so did the sound of his footsteps overhead, a sound no locked door, no whispered prayer could keep hidden forever. The attic was no room for living. Its beams sagged under the weight of years, the air thick with dust and the smell of wood long forgotten by polish. But for Malachi it was the only world he had ever known. A single slit of a window let in light by day, carving a thin silver line across the floor. At night the moon spilled through in fractured pieces, bathing his small frame in a glow both ghostly and tender. He listened to the laughter from below, to the clink of glasses and the music of the parlor. To him, those sounds were not the echoes of life, but the evidence of a world denied. Yet even in his confinement, Malachi carried something the mistress had not foreseen: memory. The boy remembered the warmth of his father's arms before he was torn away. He remembered the lullabies hummed in secret, the gentle touch of those who were told never to love him. And with memory came defiance. Malachi began to whisper to himself in the stillness, weaving stories from shadows, promising that one day he would step into the light below and speak his name so the whole house would hear. But whispers travel, and though the mistress locked the attic door each night, there were others in the house, others who pressed their ear to the ceiling beams, catching fragments of the forbidden child's voice. Rumors, once woken, never go back to sleep. It began as nothing more than murmurs. A maid swore she heard footsteps above while she swept the dining room. A stable boy claimed he saw a face, pale and watching, peering from the attic window at dusk. The mistress silenced them with sharp eyes and sharper words. "Rats," she said. "Only rats." But the servants knew better. They had carried too many secrets of the house to mistake a child's breath for the scratching of vermin. At night, when the work was done and the fires burned low, the slaves huddled together in the quarters, voices hushed but certain. They spoke of Malachi, the boy in the rafters, the boy who was both master and kin, trapped in a place where neither name nor blood could protect him. Some pitied him, some feared him. A few believed he was marked, chosen by something greater than the mistress's cruelty. For what child, hidden in such darkness, could grow without being touched by forces unseen? One thing became clear. The house itself seemed to hold its breath. Doors creaked when no one touched them. The floor groaned with weight when all stood still. The mansion carried the secret in its bones, as though it, too, waited for the day Malachi would step out of the shadows. And the mistress, though she kept her lips pressed shut, began to feel it too. For every whisper in the halls was a thread unraveling, pulling her carefully woven world closer to ruin. It happened on a night heavy with storm. Rain lashed the shutters, thunder shook the windows, and the lamps in the hall flickered with each crack of the sky. The household gathered in uneasy silence, their songs and chatter drowned beneath the roar of the weather. And then, silence. A silence too sudden, too sharp. The servants froze. The mistress stiffened. For from the attic above came a sound no storm could mask, the slow, deliberate creak of a door. Every head turned upward. The attic door, usually locked, now hung slightly open, a sliver of darkness spilling down the stairwell. And in that darkness stood a figure, small, thin, but unmistakably human. Malachi. His eyes were wide, reflecting the lamplight like mirrors, and for the first time the house saw the boy the mistress had tried so long to erase. His hair hung in untamed curls, his clothes little more than scraps, yet there was something in his gaze, not fear, not shame, but a quiet defiance that pierced the silence like a blade. The mistress gasped, clutching at her pearls. A maid dropped her tray, porcelain shattering against the floor. No one spoke, no one dared. Malachi did not cry out, did not run. He simply stood there, the storm behind him, as though he had stepped out of the thunder itself. And in that moment, the house, master, mistress, servant alike, realized the truth. The secret was no longer in the attic. It was alive, breathing, watching, and it would never return to silence. The moment stretched like glass, ready to shatter. The storm raged outside, but the greater storm was inside the house. The mistress's face drained of color, her hands trembling, though she gripped the banister as if to steady the entire world. "Back," she whispered, then louder. "Back!" Her voice cracked like a whip, sharp enough to slice the silence. Malachi did not move. His bare feet clung to the top stair, his thin frame outlined against the lightning beyond the window. For a heartbeat, it seemed he might descend, might claim the ground below as his own. But the mistress was quicker. She lunged forward, seizing his wrist with a strength born of terror. The boy flinched, but he did not fight. His silence was sharper than any scream, his gaze burning into hers with something she could not name. Grief, defiance, prophecy. With a force that startled even herself, she dragged him upward, shoving him back through the attic door. The hinges wailed as it slammed shut, and the key turned with trembling hands. The servants stood frozen, eyes lowered, yet every one of them had seen. They had witnessed the boy's face, his shadow on the stairwell, the proof of blood and sin walking in their midst. No denial, no word of rats or ghosts could bury what had been revealed. The mistress pressed her back to the locked door, chest heaving, pearls broken and scattered across the floor. The storm outside rolled on, but within her heart another storm had begun, one she could no longer control. And above her head, in the attic darkness, Malachi's breath came steady and unbroken. He had been forced back into shadows, but he knew now the house had seen him. And once seen, a secret never sleeps again. By morning, the storm had passed, but its echo lingered. The broken porcelain was swept away, the pearls gathered, the door to the attic locked once more. Outwardly, the house returned to its careful order. Yet beneath the surface, something had shifted. The servants whispered as they worked, their voices low, their eyes darting to the ceiling beams as though afraid the boy himself might be listening. One had seen his face, another had heard his breath. Soon the story grew, like ivy on stone, unstoppable, winding, alive. The boy in the attic became more than a secret. He became a shadow passed from mouth to mouth, reshaped with each telling. Some said he was pale as bone, others that his eyes glowed like embers. Some swore he was a curse, born to bring ruin on the house. Others whispered he was chosen, that God had hidden him above them all for a reason yet to be revealed. The mistress heard the whispers. She silenced them with threats, with lashes, with the cold steel of her gaze. But words are like smoke. They slip through cracks no hand can close. Before long, the story escaped the quarters. It seeped into the fields, drifted into the neighboring estates, carried on the lips of those who visited the house and swore they felt a presence above their heads. And Malachi, crouched in his narrow world of dust and shadows, heard it too. He pressed his ear to the wooden boards, listening as his name, his forbidden name, traveled the halls below. He was no longer unseen, no longer unspoken. He had become a rumor, and rumors, once they walk, cannot be chained. It was during a gathering, a warm evening, lanterns glowing on the veranda, glasses filled with sweet wine. Laughter floated into the night air, and the mistress carried herself with the practiced charm of a woman who had everything under control. But control is a fragile mask. As the guests settled inside, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. Not a storm this time, only the restless voice of summer. One gentleman, a visiting planter from 2 counties over, excused himself from the parlor and wandered the halls, curious of the house's age and grandeur. That was when he heard it. A faint shuffle overhead. Too heavy for rats, too human for doubt. His eyes rose to the ceiling. He followed the sound up the narrow staircase, where the air grew warmer, thicker. The attic door was cracked just slightly, and in that sliver of darkness he caught sight of something that froze his blood. A face. Thin, ghostly, pressed to the gap. Eyes that reflected the lantern light like shards of glass. The man stumbled back, muttering a curse. When the mistress found him moments later, his face was pale, his glass trembling in his hand. He asked her who else lived in the house, what child hid upstairs, watching with eyes too old for his years. The mistress's smile faltered. For the first time, she could not weave a lie fast enough. She hushed him, drew him back to the parlor, tried to bury the fear beneath more wine and song. But the damage was done. The guest had seen. And once a stranger sees the hidden, the secret is no longer yours to hold. Above them, in the attic shadows, Malachi's breath quickened. He knew something had shifted again. His world was breaking wider, and soon, no door would be strong enough to hold him. The guest left the following morning, tipping his hat to the mistress with a smile too stiff to be sincere. His carriage wheels groaned over the dirt road, carrying him away from the plantation, but his silence did not follow him. By the time he reached the next town, his tongue had loosened. Over supper, in the glow of an inn's lantern, he told what he had seen. At first he spoke cautiously, as though doubting his own memory. But the more the wine flowed, the more vivid his tale became. He spoke of a boy hidden in the attic. A boy with wild hair, with eyes like burning glass, with a presence that made the air heavy. He told it like a ghost story. A strange curiosity from a house too proud to admit its sins. And those who listened leaned closer, their faces pale, their questions hungry. The story spread from mouth to mouth, shifting shape as all rumors do. In one version, the boy was chained by his ankles. In another, he had never spoken a word since birth. Some swore he was the mistress's sin made flesh, others that he was a spirit born of the storm. Back at the plantation, the mistress felt the change before she heard it. Visitors looked too long at the ceilings. Neighbors watched her with eyes that smiled but did not trust. Servants flinched when she entered, as though they knew the walls themselves were whispering. And Malachi, above them all, began to hear faint echoes drift back to him. Words carried on the wind, stories that stretched far beyond the attic beams. He was no longer just a rumor in one house. He was becoming something larger, a legend. And legends do not die quietly. For years, the attic had been his world. Dust, rafters, and the faint line of moonlight that crept across the floor. But now Malachi felt the weight of whispers pressing against the walls, as though the voices outside were calling him, daring him, demanding him to step beyond. He began to test the limits of his prison. At first, small things. A hand pressed to the crack beneath the door, the faint scrape of his feet against the boards when the house was quiet. Then, Bolder steps, pushing at the latch, prying the hinges with fingers grown strong from years of silence. The mistress noticed. She heard the door shift in the night, felt the floor groan with his pacing. Each morning, her heart raced as she climbed the stairs, terrified she would find the door ajar, the attic empty, the house invaded by the very secret she had tried so hard to chain. But Malachi's defiance was no longer hidden. One night, as the lamps burned low, the servants in the hall heard him. A voice, low, rough, yet unmistakably human, drifting down through the boards, words they could not fully understand, but words nonetheless. A boy who should not exist had spoken, and the house trembled with the sound. For the first time, Malachi was not content to be legend or rumor. He was ready to be more. And once a voice escapes, it cannot be returned to silence. The mistress of the house had lived her life in careful poise, chin high, voice steady, every movement rehearsed for the eyes of neighbors and kin. But as the days wore on, that poise began to crack. She heard him everywhere. In the creak of the rafters above the dining room, in the soft rhythm of steps while she tried to sleep, in the whisper of his voice, threading through her prayers like a shadow she could not shake. The servants noticed the change. Her commands grew sharp, her punishments harsher. She accused them of talking when they had not, of listening when they dared not raise their heads. But fear is a poor mortar. It holds nothing together for long. In the parlor, when guests gathered, she laughed too quickly, poured her glass too often. Behind her eyes, a storm brewed, wild and restless. More than once she nearly slipped, a word too sharp, a glance too sudden toward the attic stair. And the house, once a stage of order, now carried her madness in its bones. Doors slammed without wind, candles guttered for no reason, the very walls seemed to groan with the weight of her lies. At night she climbed the stairs with her tray of bread and water, her hands trembling so violently the plate rattled. Malachi would sit in the shadows, watching her with calm eyes, his silence louder than her words. She hated him for that silence, feared him for in it she saw her end, not in fire, not in storm, but in exposure. And exposure was worse than death. For the slaves and servants of the house, life had always been measured in silence. They spoke little, moved carefully, and carried the weight of obedience like chains across their shoulders. But Malachi's existence changed something. At first they had whispered of him with fear, a hidden child, born of sin, locked away like a ghost. Yet as the weeks passed, fear began to turn into something else, something heavier, brighter. Hope. They began to see him not as a curse but as a sign, a child of two worlds, denied both, yet alive, alive despite the mistress's cruelty, alive despite the silence forced upon him. To them, Malachi was proof that even secrets could not be buried forever. In the quiet of the night, they spoke of him around dying fires. They told each other he was chosen, that God himself had placed him above them, closer to heaven, waiting for the right moment to step down and lead them out of their bondage. Eyes once heavy with resignation now lifted toward the attic beams, ears strained to catch his footsteps as if each creak carried a promise. The more the mistress tried to silence him, the stronger his presence became among them. For in Malachi's hidden life they saw their own, and in his quiet defiance they found the stirrings of their own. The attic, once a place of shame, was becoming something more dangerous than the mistress could ever imagine. A sanctuary, a prophecy, and prophecy cannot be locked behind any door. The mistress felt it before she saw it, the shift, the change in their eyes. The servants still bowed, still obeyed her words, still carried trays and polished silver. But something had gone missing, that old tremor of fear, the silence that used to fill the air around her. Now, when her back turned, she heard whispers not smothered quickly enough. When she entered a room, she felt gazes lift from the floor too slowly, as though they were measuring her, questioning her. It was Malachi. She knew it. The boy had become more than a burden. He had become an anchor pulling her world apart. One evening, as she walked the hall, she caught two maids pausing beneath the attic beams. Their lips moved in prayer, their eyes raised not to heaven but to the ceiling above, to him. Rage boiled inside her. She struck them both, but their silence afterward carried no fear, only defiance. And in that defiance, she saw her future unraveling. The house was no longer hers. Not truly. It belonged to the whispers, to the footsteps above, to the legend that grew in the attic. The servants obeyed her hands, but their hearts leaned upward, to the boy she tried to bury in shadows. The mistress began to realize a truth far more terrifying than scandal. She was losing control, and once control is lost, power does not return. It shifts, and in that shift, the house began to tilt toward Malachi. Malachi had lived his life in shadows, but shadows see more than light ever admits. From the cracks in the attic floorboards he watched. He studied the movements below, the mistress pacing with anxious steps, the servants whispering in corners, the overseer glancing upward as if listening for sounds that weren't there. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence became his language, and it carried a weight heavier than words. Each night, as he lay on the rough boards, the house itself seemed to breathe with him. The dogs in their pens stirred when he stirred. The lamps flickered when his breath deepened. And the servants, they began to look for signs, as if his stillness held prophecy. Malachi began to understand. It wasn't fear that bound them anymore. It was attention, their eyes, their thoughts, their hidden reverence. It all fed into him. Slowly, invisibly, he became more than a boy locked away. He became a presence, a quiet force, a living curse that walked the halls without moving. He understood now why the mistress trembled. She thought she had caged him, hidden him where no one could see, but in trying to erase him, she had made him unavoidable. The more she tried to silence him, the louder his absence grew, and Malachi began to realize silence could rule a house more completely than the loudest command. The villagers spoke of it only in whispers, the mirror in the Hale home. It had hung in the main hall for nearly 40 years, its frame carved from blackened oak, its glass polished until it seemed less like an object and more like a silent observer. Guests often remarked that it felt too alive, as though it carried a memory of every soul that had ever stood before it. When Tobias's son Samuel turned 13, the mirror began to change. He would catch glimpses that didn't belong, his reflection smiling when he was not, or a shadow moving behind him when the room was empty. Sometimes his reflection lingered a second too long after he turned away, as though unwilling to release him. The Hales dismissed these things at first. Tobias had no patience for superstition, and his wife Margaret insisted the boy was simply imaginative. But Samuel grew withdrawn, refusing to pass the mirror after dusk. One night the housekeeper found him standing before it, pale and trembling. He whispered that the mirror had spoken his name. The villagers remembered the boy's words because of what happened next. Samuel began to lose weight, his eyes ringed with sleeplessness. He said the mirror showed him things, an endless corridor of black doors, a garden where flowers wept instead of blooming, a version of himself who whispered secrets in a voice that was not his own. Tobias raged, ordering the mirror covered with a heavy drape, but the cloth would not stay. Night after night the family awoke to find it uncovered, the glass glimmering faintly as though lit from within. Margaret swore she heard a low humming at dawn, a sound that seemed to come from the mirror itself, vibrating like a held breath. On the night of the harvest moon, Samuel disappeared. His shoes remained by the hall door, his candle still burning in the stand. The only clue was the mirror. For the first time in its long life, its surface was not reflective, but dark. So dark it seemed like an open passage into something else. Some claimed Tobias smashed it in fury. Others said he tried to follow his son through it. Whatever the truth, the mirror was never seen again, and neither was Samuel. The villagers had one final whisper, that the boy hadn't been taken. He had simply stepped into the version of himself that had been waiting all along. After Samuel vanished, the Hale house changed. It was not sudden, not like a storm breaking in one night, but gradual, as though the walls themselves had begun to carry memory. Villagers who entered, servants, neighbors, tradesmen, spoke of an atmosphere so heavy it pressed down on the lungs, as though the house disapproved of their breathing. It began with small things. Tobias's silver pocket watch, a gift from his father, ticked erratically, sometimes running backward for hours. Margaret's porcelain comb, kept neatly on her vanity, was often found resting in the kitchen, damp with condensation, as though it had been outside in the night air. The old grandfather clock in the parlor struck 13 at midnight, then fell silent for days at a time. But these were not the strangest. The most unsettling were the voices. A visitor might pick up a teacup and hear faintly the sound of Samuel's laughter echoing within its hollow. The creak of the rocking chair in the nursery seemed to carry a sigh, unmistakably human. Even the hearthstones, when pressed by hand, seemed to release whispers in a language that no one could understand. Wet, guttural, like earth speaking through water. Margaret grew ill. She claimed the house was turning against her, that it wanted her gone. She said the objects did not merely move or speak, they watched. Once she awoke to find every mirror in the house uncovered, their faces gleaming though she had draped them herself. Tobias, ever the skeptic, accused her of hysteria, but when he touched the drapes, they were stiff with frost. The villagers stayed away. Deliveries were left at the edge of the property. No one dared enter after sunset, not even to collect their wages. They spoke of the Hale estate as cursed, a place where the ordinary rules of matter and time no longer held. Tobias, consumed with anger, refused to abandon the house. He would pace the halls at night, his lantern swinging, muttering that no object, no trick of wood or glass could defy his will. But the villagers noticed something else. His eyes had begun to change. They grew distant, unfocused, as though he too were becoming part of the house. And in the village, a whisper spread like smoke. The Hales built their fortune on dead soil. Now the dead were claiming it back, one object at a time. Tobias Hale had always been a man of command, a voice sharp as an axe, a will that could bend laborers and merchants alike. But the house had learned him, and it had found the cracks. At first his defiance was almost comical, shouting at rocking chairs, slamming doors as if to punish them, scattering the combs and watches into the fire. But the fire spat them back. Margaret's porcelain comb reappeared on her pillow, unburnt. The watch ticked steadily on the mantel, though Tobias swore he had smashed it beneath his boot. The grandfather clock, the one that struck 13, began to echo his heartbeat, slow, then rapid, then staggered, as though it were taking command of his very pulse. Sleep abandoned him. At night he wandered with his lantern, his skin drawn tight across his bones. Servants whispered that he muttered names in his rounds, not theirs, not Samuel's, but other names, older names, ones no Christian tongue should have carried. His eyes followed things unseen, darting to corners, to ceilings, as though threads hung there pulling him. He began writing, though he had never been a man for ink and paper. By candlelight, he filled ledger after ledger with looping black symbols, not words but shapes, spirals that coiled back upon themselves, figures that looked less like handwriting and more like maps to places no one could travel. The pages trembled in his hands, as if alive. Margaret begged him to leave, to abandon the estate and flee to her kin in Savannah, but Tobias laughed at her suggestion. His voice cracked with fever as he said, "The house listens. If I go, it follows. You don't run from your own shadow." The servants began to flee one by one, taking nothing with them, abandoning wages, belongings, even kin left behind. By midsummer, the house stood nearly empty, its vast halls echoing only with Tobias's lantern steps and Margaret's faint weeping. And yet, Hollow Creek spoke of him constantly. Children whispered that Tobias's reflection no longer appeared in the river. Farmers claimed they saw him walking the fields at midnight barefoot, though the soil smoked under his steps. Some swore the Hale house breathed, the shutters inhaling and exhaling, as if Tobias himself had become its lungs. The man who once commanded men now served something he could neither see nor resist. And all the while, in the attic above, the silence of Malachi pressed heavier, as if he were waiting. Margaret Hale had been raised in drawing rooms, taught the gentility of lace and scripture, but by the summer of Tobias's unravelling, refinement had abandoned her. Her gowns hung loose on her frame, her voice cracked when she spoke, and her hands, once soft with oil and powder, were raw from clawing at locked doors and shuttered windows. She had come to believe what the villagers whispered, that Tobias was no longer simply her husband, but the vessel of something old, something bound into the soil before the house had risen from its stones. She watched him wander in fevered circles, his eyes glazed, his lips repeating words that chilled her marrow. She listened as the house answered him, boards groaning in rhythm, flames flaring when he breathed, the grandfather clock chiming in time with his muttered prayers. Margaret resolved to act, not to save Tobias, though part of her still prayed he could be spared, but to free herself and the child hidden above, Malachi. For weeks she had ignored the attic, as though forgetting it could dissolve the guilt she carried. But in the blackness of her sleepless nights, she swore she felt the boy's silence pressing downward, suffocating her more than Tobias's ravings. She turned at last to the only help left to her, the old root worker who lived beyond the marshes, a woman the villagers spoke of in hushed tones. They said she carried charms against the restless dead, that she could bind spirits back into soil or drive them screaming from walls. To visit her was to court damnation, yet Margaret no longer cared for reputation or salvation. She cared only for release. One night, cloaked and trembling, she stole into the marshlands. The air there was thicker, buzzing with flies, the mud warm beneath her boots. When she found the woman's hut, lit by a single blue flame, she confessed everything. The house that whispered, the husband who no longer slept, the boy in the attic whose silence was louder than any cry. The old woman listened without blinking, her face lined with centuries of secrets. At last she said, "The boy is not your burden. The soil claimed him the night he was born. You kept him breathing, but you did not stop the claiming. What you hear now is the house remembering." Margaret begged for a charm, for any tool that might sever Tobias from the house's grip. The woman gave her a bundle of herbs bound in red string, warning her, "You may save one, husband or child, never both." Margaret returned to the Hale estate before dawn, clutching the bundle, her mind torn between two lives she could not join together. Upstairs, Malachi's silence deepened. Downstairs, Tobias scrawled black spirals on the walls, and Margaret knew the night was coming when she would have to choose. The night Margaret chose to act was heavy with storm air. Clouds pressed low over Hollow Creek, muffling sound, sealing the estate in a silence that seemed to wait. Tobias had fallen into a fitful stupor in the parlor, his ink-stained hands still twitching as though he wrote even in sleep. Upstairs, Malachi remained motionless in the attic, unseen, unheard, but felt in every corner of the house. Margaret lit no lamp. She feared the house would notice. Instead, she crept barefoot down the hall with the rootworker's charm clutched tight in her palm, herbs blackened and brittle, bound with a string the color of blood. She was meant to place it where Tobias lay, to draw out the thing that breathed through him, to break the thread that tied him to the house. Her hand shook as she lowered the bundle onto his chest. For a moment, all was still. Tobias's breathing eased. His shoulders slackened. Margaret dared to hope. Then the grandfather clock struck. Once, twice, 13 times. The air curdled. The bundle burst into flame without smoke, without heat. The string hissed and fell away. Tobias's body arched, his eyes snapping open, pupils blown wide like ink spilled across parchment. His mouth opened, but it was not his voice that spoke. "You brought her here," it hissed, though the words seemed to crawl from the floorboards themselves. "You think she can unmake what the soil remembers?" The parlor walls shuddered. Paint cracked in spreading veins. The spiral symbols Tobias had drawn began to glow faintly, pulsing in time with the clock's 13 strokes. Margaret staggered back, clutching her skirts. The charm had not weakened the house. It had provoked it. Tobias rose, his limbs jerking as though pulled by invisible strings. His eyes rolled toward the ceiling. "The boy," the voice rasped, "was promised. You hide him above, but the house has already claimed his brat. Return him or we take you." Margaret froze, her chest heaving. The attic door groaned above them, opening on its own. A draft swept down the stairwell, smelling of wet soil and candle smoke. Malachi's silence, once distant, now pressed so heavily that Margaret's ears rang, and for the first time she understood the truth behind the root worker's warning. She could save Tobias, or she could save Malachi, but not both. The house no longer whispered, it roared. Every beam groaned, every window shuddered as though it might burst. Tobias stood in the parlor like a puppet, his arms trembling in unnatural angles, his mouth opening and closing as the voice inside him demanded the same words over and over. Return him, return him, return him. Margaret staggered back toward the stairwell. Her heart was a drum, her breath shallow. She thought of the bundle of herbs now ash at her feet, of the root worker's warning, and of the silence above her head, Malachi's silence, heavy as stone, impossible to ignore. Her skirts brushed the walls as she climbed, and the walls sighed, not creaked, sighed. They exhaled against her like lungs. She wanted to scream, but the house would devour the sound. At the attic door, she froze. The latch had already slid open. A draught poured out, cold as the grave, smelling of iron and rain. Margaret pushed the door wider. There he was, Malachi. He sat in the corner as he always had, knees drawn up, face pale in the gloom. But something was different. His eyes were open. They had always been downcast before, half-lidded, but now they fixed on her. Dark, endless, knowing. "Mother," he whispered. Her breath caught. He had never spoken before. The single word carried the weight of years unsaid, of silence hoarded, until it became a blade. Tears burned her eyes. Behind her, Tobias's voice thundered up the stairs. "Return him, Margaret. The soil calls. The house waits. Return him." The floor trembled beneath her. Dust rained from the rafters. Margaret fell to her knees before the boy. "I cannot give you to them," she whispered. "I kept you hidden all these years. I bore their hatred for you, because I knew you were mine." Malachi tilted his head. His voice was calm, too calm. "But was I ever yours, or was I always theirs?" The words sliced her deeper than Toby, as threats. She reached for him, desperate to gather him into her arms, to save something, someone. But the house groaned louder. The beams buckled. The clock downstairs struck again. 14 this time. The choice was closing in. Behind her, Tobias's footsteps pounded upward. Before her, Malachi's silence deepened into something vast, something that did not belong to any child. And Margaret Hale realized she stood between husband and son, between the living and the claimed. The house demanded its price. The attic shook as though the storm had entered it whole. Shingles rattled, beams cracked, and the air itself pressed down so thickly Margaret thought her lungs would burst. Tobias appeared in the doorway, his lantern swinging wildly, his eyes not his own. The glow from the spirals carved across his arms and chest pulsed with each step he took. His mouth hung open, but the voice that came from it was not Tobias. "Choose, Margaret. The soil will not wait. Husband or son, one to remain, one to return." Margaret's tears streaked the dust on her face. Her gaze darted between them. Her husband, once a man of command, now reduced to a vessel, and the boy she had hidden for years, whose silence had become the house's language. Malachi did not beg, he did not cry. He simply sat, watching her with eyes that were too steady for a child's. It was as if he knew this moment had always been coming, and that his mother had always been walking toward it. Margaret rose to her feet, shaking. "You will not take him," she whispered. Her hands clutched at her bodice, finding the rosary she had sewn into the lining years ago, more out of habit than faith. She ripped it free, held it before her like a blade. The house laughed. The walls trembled with it, floorboards splitting underfoot. Tobias staggered closer, his lantern crashing to the ground, fire licking at the edges of the room. Margaret cried out, not in prayer, not in despair, but in defiance. She lunged toward Malachi, pulling him into her arms. His body was cold, unnaturally heavy, but she held him all the same. "Then take me," she screamed. "Take me. But leave him. The house stilled, the laughter cut off, even the flames seemed to pause. Tobias collapsed to his knees, his eyes rolling back. The spirals dimmed from his skin. A silence fell so absolute it drowned the storm outside. Then the boards beneath Margaret split wit. Day. The attic floor yawned open like a grave, black earth steaming below. The air sucked downward, pulling Malachi. She clutched him tighter, even as her nails tore against his cold skin. For a heartbeat, the boy spoke again, his lips brushing her ear. Mother, it was always meant to be you. And the floor swallowed them whole. The house exhaled. The fire died. Tobias lay sprawled, empty-eyed upon the boards. Margaret was gone. Malachi was gone. But Hollow Creek would never again be free of their silence. At dawn, the storm broke, leaving Hollow Creek wrapped in a damp, uneasy stillness. Smoke drifted from the Hale estate, but no fire consumed it. The villagers gathered at the edges of the fields, staring at the great house that loomed against the grey sky. It was whole, unburnt, yet it felt ruined. No one dared cross the threshold. They called Tobias' name, but he did not answer. When a few braver men stepped forward, they found the front door wide open, swinging on its hinges, though no wind stirred. Inside, the halls were dark. They discovered Tobias in the parlor, alive but broken. He sat slumped against the wall, his skin pale, his eyes blank as porcelain. When spoken to, he muttered nonsense. Spirals, circles, fragments of names that twisted on the tongue. No one could rouse him to sense. Margaret was nowhere. Malachi was nowhere. The servants who had remained swore that both had vanished in the night, swallowed into the attic itself. But when the men climbed the stairs to see for themselves, the attic was gone. The stairwell rose only to a sealed wall, as if the uppermost floor had never existed. Word spread quickly through Hollow Creek. Some said Margaret had sacrificed herself to spare the boy. Others whispered the boy had claimed her, dragging her into the soil as his rightful offering. The old women murmured that the Hale line had paid the price for building their fortune on cursed land, that Margaret's scream, carried on the storm wind, was the soil taking back its due. Children were warned never to stray near the Hale property. Farmers crossed themselves when they ploughed its borders. By harvest, the house was shunned, its windows staring blank across empty fields, its doors sagging open as though waiting. But silence lingered. Those who passed on moonless nights claimed they heard footsteps pacing inside, though the house was abandoned. A woman's voice, ice, low and breaking, sometimes drifted through the trees, and worst of all, villagers said if you pressed your ear to the soil near the foundations, you could hear a child breathing beneath the earth, steady, patient, waiting for someone to listen long enough. Hollow Creek stopped speaking of the Hales in daylight, but around the fire, in whispers, they told the tale of the mistress who bartered with shadows, and the boy whose silence outlived them all. And always, they ended with the same warning. Do not go near the Hale house, for some bargains do not end with the dead. Years passed, but the Hale estate never softened into ruin. Ivy crept over its stones, shutters sagged from their frames, yet the house remained stubbornly upright, like a sentinel that refused to fall. The fields around it grew wild, untended, but villagers swore nothing truly died there. Even weeds seemed to hold their shape too long, grass standing stiff in frost as if listening. The children of Hollow Creek turned the place into a dare. Boys carved circles on their arms with pocket knives, imitating the spirals Tobias had scrawled. Girls whispered to the windows, daring the Hale boy to answer. At night, gangs of them crept close, their courage swelled by each other's laughter, though the laughter always broke into silence once they reached the fence line. They said if you called Malachi 3 times before the broken gate, the house would breathe. Some claimed they saw the curtains shift, though no wind stirred. Others swore they heard soft knocking from the earth itself, as though someone trapped beneath the soil was begging release. One summer, 2 boys, Elias Porter and Jonah Reed, decided to prove the tales were nothing but superstition. Armed with lanterns and bravado, they pushed open the sagging front doors and stepped inside. They were gone less than an hour. Elias returned alone, screaming. He was found in the village square, his eyes wide, his hair streaked with white, though he was barely 12. He never spoke again, not a word, only sat with his knees drawn to his chest, rocking as though trying to soothe something no one else could see. Jonah was never found, not a scrap of clothing, not a footprint, not even a trace of ash. From that summer onward, the dares stopped. Parents locked their children inside on moonless nights. The house grew quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that demanded attention, the kind that felt like listening. Old Hall. Our Creek folk whispered that the boy in the soil was still there, growing, that every whisper, every glance, every fearful story fed him. Malachi had been hidden in silence his whole life, and now silence itself had become his inheritance. And though the attic was sealed, some swore if you looked at the upper windows long enough, you would see a pale face staring back. Not Tobias, not Margaret, but the boy who had never truly left. By the turn of the century, Hollow Creek had learned to live with its silence. The villagers spoke little of the Hale House, and when they did, their voices fell to whispers. But word has a way of slipping past fences and fields, especially when it carries the scent of mystery. Stories traveled, first to neighboring towns, then farther. They reached the ears of preachers who claimed the place was a wound on holy ground. They reached scholars who hunted the strange as if cataloguing beasts. They reached drifters and wanderers who thought themselves braver than the people who had lived with the house's shadow their whole lives. By 1902, Hollow Creek saw a steady trickle of outsiders. Men with thick spectacles and notebooks stood at the gate sketching the house's shape, measuring angles as if geometry could explain the silence. Traveling ministers arrived with crosses and flasks of oil, declaring they would cleanse the soil, only to leave pale and trembling before dawn. One shouted at the townsfolk as he rode away, swearing the house had no demon inside it. The house itself was the demon. Then came the seekers. Young men who saw the Hale estate not as a curse but a challenge. They carried rifles and lanterns, bottles of whiskey to steel their nerves. They swore they would spend a night inside, that they would return with proof of the boy or the mistress or the treasures the family had left behind. Not one of them lasted until morning. Some returned broken, silent, like Elias Porter years before. Others returned with mouths full of words that bent into nonsense, sentences spiraling back upon themselves until the villagers could not bear to listen. More never returned at all. The villagers stopped opening their doors to outsiders. They grew tired of burying what was left of them. Hollow Creek became known less as a town and more as the place beside the house, a village, living in the shadow of Malachi's silence. And through it all, the house remained. Its shutters sagged deeper, its paint flaked, its roof buckled. Yet it never collapsed. Each time the wind howled, the structure seemed to bow, then stiffen, as if refusing to yield. Some nights, when the moon was fat and white, travelers swore the windows gleamed as though lit from within, though the house had been abandoned for decades. The silence endured, and silence, as Hollow Creek had learned, could be far louder than screams. In 1906, the outsiders had slowed to a trickle. The Hale estate's reputation was no longer just a curiosity, it was a warning. Most who came stayed only long enough to see the crooked gate and the staring windows before retreating to safer towns. But one man did not leave. His name was Dr. Alistair Greeley, a physician from Baltimore with a fascination for maladies of the mind. He arrived with 2 trunks of instruments, scalpels, vials, strange brass devices for measuring pulses and rhythms of sleep. Unlike the seekers before him, he did not bring rifles or whiskey. He brought patience. He told the villagers he was there to observe, not to conquer. The people of Hollow Creek begged him to turn back. They spoke of vanished children, broken men, Margaret's scream, swallowed by the soil. Greeley only smiled thinly, taking notes in a hand that moved with surgical precision. Every illness, he told them, reveals itself to the man willing to wait. And so he waited. He took up residence in the house itself, dragging his trunks across the threshold with no hesitation. For weeks the villagers watched from a distance as his lanterns glowed in the windows at night, the beams cutting across rooms that had been dark for decades. By day, he wandered the fields plucking samples of soil, bits of vine, even shards of the house's broken shutters, tucking them into glass jars like rare specimens. At first, nothing happened. The house remained still, silent, watchful. Greeley wrote in his journals that the locals were gripped by superstition, that the Hale estate was nothing more than a rotting structure ripe with mold and echoes. But then, the silence began to touch him. His reports grew erratic. The villagers who peeked into his journals claimed his writing lost its shape, spiraling into loops, notations bleeding into one another until they looked like Tobias Hale circles. All over again. He stopped walking into town. His lanterns no longer flickered steadily but burned with sudden erratic bursts, like breathing. One night a farmhand swore he saw Greeley standing at an upstairs window, his face pressed against the glass, eyes wide, lips moving. Behind him, just for a moment, another figure appeared. Smaller, pale, a child's silhouette. The next morning, Greeley's voice was heard in the village square, though no man stood there. It whispered, soft but clear. The boy is not gone. He waits for the right listener. From that day forward, no one saw Dr. Greeley again. The house had swallowed him whole, just as it had Margaret, Malachi, and Jonah before him. But in the weeks that followed, Hollow Creek noticed something new. The soil nearest the Hale estate grew blacker, richer, sprouting weeds as tall as men. And at night, in the heavy quiet, more than one villager swore they could hear the sound of a pen scratching against paper, as though the house itself were writing now. The child, born of Malachi's covenant, raised in the shadow of the Iron Cross and the Garden of Bone, was unlike any other. By his 7th year, villagers claimed his gaze could strip a man of memory, leaving him hollow-eyed, unable to recall his own name. Mothers dragged their children from the roads when he walked, fearing his presence was a curse. But the truth was far darker. He was not merely cursed. He was the curse made flesh. This child carried what the old ones whispered of as blood memory. It was not knowledge learned, but knowledge embedded into the marrow, carried from father to son across centuries of forbidden pacts. He could recall events he had never lived, the screams of peasants burning in wars before his birth, the chants of priests whose tongues had long turned to dust, the smell of his own ancestors buried in earth centuries before he drew his first breath. Malachi watched him carefully, torn between horror and reverence. He had asked for power, for a lineage that would not fade, but in the child he saw something older than lineage. This was not continuation, this was invasion. Something had used him, had burrowed into his bloodline, and now it walked the earth wrapped in the fragile skin of a boy. At night, Malachi heard the boy whispering in his sleep. Not in English, not in Latin, but in the same ancient tongue that Malachi had first heard when the soil bled under his shovel. It was a language of ash and bone, one that promised to erase all divisions of time, binding the living and the dead as one. The boy was not speaking it. The boy was remembering it. One autumn night, the villagers attempted what they thought was mercy. They crept toward Malachi's house with ropes, with fire, with trembling hands, ready to burn the boy before he grew into something they could no longer bind. But when they broke through the door, they found Malachi already already waiting, the boy standing silently at his side. The villagers dropped their torches. One man began to scream, clawing at his own face. Another dropped dead without a wound. The boy did not move. He only stared. And in that silence, Malachi finally understood. He had not fathered a child. He had opened a door. By the winter of 1868, the boy's power had ripened into something no priest, no scholar, no charlatan could name. He no longer merely remembered the dead, he could rearrange the living. A glance, a murmur, a touch of his hand, and men forgot their wives, mothers forgot their children, and entire bloodlines unraveled as though they had never existed. The boy was not killing them, he was editing them, removing names, severing roots, rewriting the very script of flesh and memory. Malachi kept him hidden at first, praying some prayerless night might undo what had been set loose, but there was no undoing. Already the village was falling apart. Families quarreled over kin they swore had been erased. Brothers disowned brothers, convinced they were strangers. Marriages collapsed into dust as one partner forgot the other's face. The boy had become not merely a curse, but a pen in the hand of something unspeakable, something rewriting the world itself. And Malachi, torn by guilt, began to notice the pattern. The boy was not rewriting at random. He was drawing something. An invisible lattice was forming across the town, etched in the gaps of memory, in the holes left behind when entire lives were erased. What shape it formed, Malachi could not yet see, but he knew it was vast, stretching beyond the village, reaching into centuries unborn. One night, as snow blanketed the windows, Malachi awoke to find the boy standing by his bed, his eyes wide, unblinking. He whispered in that language of soil and bone, "They are not gone, Father. I only moved them. I am arranging them as they should have always been." Malachi's heart pounded. "Where?" he asked, though he already feared the answer. The boy raised a finger, pointing to the frost-laced window, where shapes seemed to shimmer faintly in the night. Not figures of the living, not ghosts of the dead, but outlines, lines of something being stitched, something preparing to step through once the lattice was complete. Malachi stumbled back, choking on the weight of his own choice. He had not unleashed power. He had not even unleashed a curse. He had opened a scripture written in blood, and his son was reading it aloud. And with each erased memory, with each forgotten face, the world was bending toward a design no mortal man had ever been meant to see. By spring, the air itself seemed to hum with something unspeakable. Birds no longer nested in the trees, as if they sensed the soil had grown hostile. The wells ran bitter, the animals thin and restless. Yet the villagers did not speak of the child anymore. Many of them no longer remembered he existed at all. Their memories had been stripped clean, whole generations plucked from their minds like weeds from a garden. But Malachi remembered. Malachi could not forget. He alone bore witness to the pattern his son was carving into the fabric of life. Every absence, every erased face, every fractured family was a line in an invisible design. And then, one night, he saw it. As he walked the barren fields at dusk, the world around him seemed to warp. The crooked fences, the abandoned homes, the very shadows bent toward one another, aligning in ways they never had before. It was a lattice of absence, a cathedral built of voids, and at the center of that emptiness was the boy, his son, standing perfectly still, his eyes open but unblinking, his breath steady as if he were a vessel, not a child. From that lattice, shapes began to emerge, not with flesh, not with blood, but with suggestion, with the outline of what should not be. Forms that bent reason, limbs too many and too few, faces both present and erased. They flickered like broken memories, half-formed yet unmistakably real. Malachi felt them in his marrow. These were not things being created, but things being remembered back into existence. The boy whispered, his voice a thread pulled taut across the night. "They are older than us, Father. Older than the soil. I am bringing them back. I am fixing the world." Malachi fell to his knees, not in prayer but in despair, for he understood what no villager ever would. The blood memory was not his inheritance, not his son's gift. It was the language of something that had lived, long before man, long before scripture, long before the soil had names. The boy was its mouth, and the world was being rewritten according to its design. The shadows lengthened. The lattice grew sharper, and through that unholy geometry, the first of the ancient forms stepped forward, not entirely here, not entirely gone, pressing against the veil as though testing the limits of flesh and time. Malachi's chest tightened. He realized the truth too late. He had not fathered a child. He had midwifed a doorway. It happened on a night when the moon was hidden and the fields lay black under a lid of silence. No wind, no crickets, no movement, just the oppressive stillness that clung to Hollow Creek like a death shroud. Malachi had prayed, begged, even cursed, but nothing stopped the lattice from tightening. And then, with a sound like stone grinding against bone, the veil gave way. The first being stepped through. It did not arrive whole. It was a stuttering of flesh and shadow, a body rearranging itself with every blink. One moment it seemed a man, the next a beast, then nothing more than a smear of smoke that burned the eyes. Its limbs unfolded like broken branches, its face stretched too wide, its jaw unhinged with a silence that screamed louder than thunder. The boy, Malachi's son, watched calmly, as if he had only opened a door for a long-awaited guest. The villagers never saw it directly. They felt it. Doors splintered without hands touching them, milk soured in the udder. Infants shrieked until their throats bled. Old men clawed their ears, swearing they could hear the earth groaning beneath their feet. By dawn, 3 homes stood empty, families gone, erased without trace, as though they had never drawn breath in this world. Their neighbors looked upon the vacant houses with vacant eyes, unable to recall who had lived there. Malachi, however, remembered every face. The erasure did not touch him. It was his curse to carry the memory of what others could not bear. He saw the thing stalking through the streets, though no one else did. He watched it linger in the churchyard, its body folding into the steeple's shadow until the cross itself seemed to bend. He saw its mouth move, though no words passed its lips, only echoes, echoes of prayers twisted backwards, hollowed into mockery. At home the boy whispered, "This is only the first, Father. The lattice will bring more. They will fill what was broken. They will restore what man has ruined." But Malachi knew restoration was a lie. What was entering the world was not meant to walk in daylight. It was memory made flesh, the oldest kind of hunger given shape. He pressed his hands against his face, weeping for the first time since the blood-soaked soil had spoken to him years ago. He had traded legacy for damnation, and now his legacy was rewriting the world. The thing vanished by sunrise, slipping back into the lattice, but its presence lingered. The cattle refused to graze, the wells remained bitter, and the boy, Malachi's own son, smiled as if proud of what had stepped through. The second crossing came not with silence, but with distortion. Hollow Creek awoke to a morning that was not morning at all. The sun rose 3 times in the span of an hour, each ascent brighter and colder than the last. Shadows bent in directions that made no sense, stretching sideways, folding back upon themselves. Church bells rang though no hand pulled the rope, their tones colliding in warped echoes like voices speaking out of order. Time itself had cracked. Malachi stood in the center of it, watching as his neighbors staggered in confusion. A woman carried water from the well, only to find the bucket empty halfway home, then full again, then shattered in her hands. A child ran through the street and, in a blink, stood younger than he had been, an infant once more, crying in his mother's arms as if the last 7 years had never happened. The boy was at the heart of it all, standing in the fields, his arms outstretched, his voice whispering words older than the soil. He was not calling. He was remembering creatures and ages that did not belong here, and with every word, the lattice bled deeper into the town. The second being stepped forward. Unlike the first, this one did not shift. It was steady, solid, a tower of flesh, shaped like a man but stretched too tall, its skin slick with a grey sheen that drank in the light. Where its eyes should have been were hollow sockets, and yet every villager felt its gaze. They froze in place, as if time itself had bent around them, trapping them in statues of flesh. Their lips parted, but no sound escaped. Malachi alone could move, cursed again with memory, cursed with witness. He staggered forward, shouting at his son, but the boy turned and smiled, calm as a prophet. "Do you see, Father? Time is not broken. Time is corrected. It was never meant to flow as men know it. I am mending it." But Malachi saw the true. The being's steps, left no footprints in the soil, yet grass withered where it passed. The sky bent above it, clouds folding like curtains being drawn aside. With each movement, hours shattered, days splintered. A single crow flew overhead, then froze in the sky, suspended, then fell dead, as if its existence had simply been revoked. The villagers would not remember this day. By nightfall, many of them would swear it had been an ordinary Sunday, but Malachi's chest burned with the knowledge that the second crossing was no arrival, it was a conquest. Time itself was being erased and rewritten. And at the center of it all stood the boy, his eyes bright, his lips murmuring the scripture of bone. Malachi had prepared for confrontation for years, but nothing in his life had prepared him for this moment. The boy stood at the edge of the frozen river, the lattice of erased time stretching behind him like a cathedral built of absence. Malachi's voice cracked as he called out, demanding answers, demanding mercy, demanding something that would undo what had been set in motion. The boy's eyes did not blink. He did not answer. And then the voice came, not from his lips, but from the air around him. A voice layered and ancient, like wind through a hollow mountain, speaking a language that twisted Malachi's blood. I am older than your memory, older than your fear. I am what has always waited, and I have chosen this vessel. Malachi fell to his knees, heart pounding. His son was not speaking. His son was channeling. Something beyond the child, something that had slumbered beneath the bones of the earth for centuries, had claimed him. Malachi realized the horror. All the lattice building, all the erasures, all the crossings. The boy was not acting alone. He was a conduit. The voice continued, filling the hollow spaces of the village with power no mortal could resist. Men try to write their own history. They fail. They betray the order of what must be. Through him, the world will remember the forgotten, reclaim the erased, and bend to what should have been. Malachi's mind recoiled. Every erased family, every splintered year, every distorted hour, the boy had not chosen them. Something older had chosen, and the boy was merely the instrument. His son's power was immense, yes, but it was guided, shaped, dictated by an intelligence that Malachi could not touch, could not reason with, could not bargain against. He tried to speak, to plead, "This is my son, stop this, you cannot claim him." The voice laughed, a sound like ice cracking in the deepest cave. Claim him? No, I dwell in him. I have always dwelled. He is mine, but he is also the world's. And soon, every man who walks this earth will be forced to remember what they were told to forget. Malachi's knees gave way beneath him. He had fought against curses, against the cruelty of men, against death itself, but this was something else entirely. His son was not a child, not a boy. He was a threshold, and the intelligence that spoke through him had plans far older, far deeper, far more terrible than anything Malachi had imagined. The boy tilted his head slightly, his lips moving in silent rhythm, and the lattice behind him pulsed, expanding, reaching outward. Malachi knew, in the marrow of his bones, that there was no stopping what was coming. It was not vengeance. It was rewriting reality itself. By the time summer arrived, Hollow Creek was no longer merely a village. It had become a node, a heart in a growing web that reached far beyond its borders. The lattice that the boy, Malachi's son, had been weaving was no longer confined to forgotten families or fractured time. It stretched outward like dark veins, touching forests, rivers, and towns hundreds of miles away. People in neighboring villages began to report strange occurrences. Clocks spinning backward, letters arriving months before they were written, entire markets collapsing as if the memory of commerce had been erased. Malachi watched helplessly from the edge of the riverbank, seeing the boy walk among the lattice's expansion like a master cartographer, arranging absence into presence, chaos into form. And yet it was not chaos. It was design. Every erasure, every distortion, every displacement was precise, deliberate, and terrifyingly beautiful. News reached Hollow Creek of a city 200 miles north, where an entire district had become uninhabitable overnight. Buildings that had stood for decades vanished from memory, maps rendered useless as if the streets had never existed. Witnesses swore the changes were deliberate, a force with intent moving through the world like a predator tracing its territory. Malachi realized with cold horror that this force was his own son, guided by the intelligence that had claimed him years ago. The boy moved through the lattice with calm, almost divine purpose. His eyes glowed faintly under the midday sun, reflecting the outlines of people and places that had been folded, erased, and rewritten, and every time he shifted, the world bent around him. Time fractured, memories splintered, and the very air seemed to hum with a tension that humans could not perceive but could feel deep in their bones. Malachi fell to his knees once again, screaming into the wind, demand. demanding an explanation, pleading for mercy, begging for reason, but the voice, the intelligence beyond the boy, answered only in whispers carried by the lattice itself. Do not fear the boy, Malachi. Fear the memory you cannot hold. Fear what will come when all that was forgotten is restored. And in that moment Malachi understood the scale of what he had unleashed. The boy was not just a child manipulating life and death in Hollow Creek. He was an agent of a power older than humanity, a force shaping the very structure of existence. And as the lattice expanded, cities, rivers, and forests became part of its geometry, invisible yet undeniably present, bending the world toward a design no man had been meant to witness. Malachi's heart ached with the knowledge that nothing could stop it. Not kings, not armies, not even the old laws of heaven or earth. The lattice had begun to write itself across the world. Malachi stood at the apex of the lattice, the world beneath him folding, twisting, reshaping like clay in the hands of a master sculptor. The boy, his son, stood silent, eyes glowing faintly, the whispers of the ancient intelligence flowing from him in waves that made the very air tremble. Cities, forests, rivers, and families, all part of the web he had become, were suspended between erasure and existence. Malachi's heart was torn. He could not hate the boy, nor could he condemn him. Every moment, every sacrifice, every horror had led to this confrontation. And now, he understood the final truth. The boy was not just a conduit, he was the instrument of choice. The intelligence spoke again, its voice threading through the lattice and into Malachi's mind. The world is unfinished, Father. Man has long ignored what was broken. Through him, the memory of what was lost and what should have been will be restored. But every restoration demands a witness. Every correction demands consent. Malachi realized the weight of what was being asked. He could step forward, embrace the boy and his destiny, and become part of the lattice, allow the world to bend fully to its ancient design. Or he could turn away, reject the boy, and risk losing him forever, allowing the force to continue its reshaping unchecked, without guidance or restraint. Every fiber of Malachi's being screamed. He saw the faces of the erased families, the stolen years, the fractured time. He saw the shadows of Hollow Creek and the cities beyond. He felt the boy's power, immense and infinite, a force beyond human comprehension, yet intimately his own flesh and blood. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down. His choice was clear, though it terrified him. He stepped forward, not as a father commanding a child, but as a witness, a participant, a vessel of understanding. The boy looked at him, eyes glowing with something almost like recognition, an acknowledgement of the gravity of this joining. The intelligence pulsed, aware that the human heart had finally consented, and then the lattice surged, expanding outward with blinding precision. Time snapped into alignment, absence and presence intertwining, memories restored and rewritten, reality bending with terrifying clarity. Malachi felt the boy's consciousness brush against his own, not as domination, but as partnership, and in that moment he understood the truth that had eluded him for decades. The boy had never been only a child, and he had never acted alone. He had always been the bridge between what humanity had forgotten and what the world needed to remember. The lattice pulsed one final time, a heartbeat that echoed across the planet, marking a world forever changed. And as Malachi stood at its center, he whispered into the void, not as a plea, but as a declaration. So be it. Let the world remember. The boy smiled, the lattice shimmered, and the shape of reality settled, forever altered, irrevocably rewritten, and bound to a destiny that no human law, no mortal mind, could ever comprehend. The dark history had ended, or perhaps had only truly begun.